Welcome back to the CTO Playbook, the podcast dedicated to helping CTOs and tech leaders excel in their roles. I'm your host, Adam Horner, a CTO coach and fractional CTO. With 30 years in the industry, including over a decade as a CTO, I have coached and mentored more than 100 engineers and tech leaders. In today's episode, we're exploring the art of scaling remote-first engineering teams with Magnus Lenngren, who is a 3-time unicorn maker. Magnus is an engineering leader who has helped grow multiple unicorn startups, including Klarna, Collector Bank, and most recently Mews. Magnus takes us on his journey through the early days of the dot-com era to scaling teams across Fintech and beyond. We discuss how he tackled the challenges of building and growing remote teams, the key factors in maintaining company culture during high growth, and a unique strategy that he calls Yawnoc. That might just be a new name that we all start using to describe how we reshape team structures, influence system design in the future. You heard it here first. The CTO Playbook is a podcast that covers crucial topics for CTOs, providing insights, strategies, and practical advice to help you excel in your role. Whether you're looking to scale your team or refine your leadership approach, this episode is filled with valuable insights and real-world advice that you can apply today. Magnus, welcome. It's wonderful to have you on the show. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much, Adam. I'm doing great. I'm so happy to be here. This is, I truly appreciate you taking the time from you and from the audience to give this to me. It's a gift.
Yeah, it should be great for the listeners as well. It should be few things to learn. I guess learning is probably a good place to start. Let's learn a little bit about you and your background. How did you start in your career, and how did you get towards somebody who's so great at scaling companies?
Yeah, scaling and growing has been kind of part of my career, I think, since I started. I started off in the IT industry back just before the initial dot-com bubble burst. So that's kind of dates me a little bit. But I didn't do university, right? This was straight from college. So because can you code HTML? Yeah, I could. And that was fine. I got the job. It wasn't mostly about coding, really. It was more about pure engineering, racking up some servers, configuring some email things and both Unix and on the Microsoft side. So I got a proper understanding of network and server infrastructure from early on in my career, which I'm forever grateful.
It's a good foundation to have, isn't it?
It is. And especially nowadays. Now you don't have to understand anything. And frankly, I can't claim I still understand it. I know the basics of TCP/IP stacks, but understanding how all the cloud and all the data centers works together now is kind of a mystery. So anyway, from there, I pretty quickly went on to become a team leader and manager after just 4 or 5 years into my career as an engineer. And since then, I've spent the last 15 years of scaling and leading engineering teams in different capacities at a few different companies.
Yeah, and amongst those companies, there's some impressive names. I mean, a lot of it has been in Fintech, hasn't it?
Yeah. Especially for the last 12 years, I think I've been pretty much full time in Fintech, more or less. Sometimes as kind of having Fintech as my primary customer. But also working in actual fintechs and 2 banks. And now you could argue that my current gig at Mews is also kind of a fintech, but kind of not. I'm happy to get into the details of that.
Yeah, well, let's talk about Mews. So, I mean, first of all, the first two, Klarna, I think is pretty much a household name. I think a lot of people will know about Klarna. But is it worth introducing Collector Bank quickly for those listeners who are not in the Nordics and aren't necessarily familiar with it?
No, exactly. Collector Bank or Norion Bank, as it's known now. It was a financial company when I started. We were less than 200 people. We were not a bank and we were not a public company. So I got that on the bucket list quite early on, just after a couple of years at Collector, 3 years, I believe. We actually went for the banking license and did an IPO at Stockholm Nasdaq at the same year. So that was some proper growth and interesting times for sure. A credit institution before, so we were already in a regulated space and had most of the foundations in place, but we were not a bank. So Collector Bank, or as I said, renamed later to Norion Bank, is kind of your Klarna, but mostly for the Nordics. It's actually a bit wider when it comes to what kind of services you're providing, because Collector had more of a wider, both consumer and business to business offering, but payments was at the core of it, at least for me. And that's where I learned the ropes in the payment industry, I think. And then after several years at Collector, I went and joined Klarna and spent a few years there obviously really rapid growth as well. And then now at Mews, which is a hospitality company. So we're building a property management system, which is kind of the system that the hotels are running to manage all the bookings, reservations, anything on the guest-facing side, including online check-in, online check-out, stuff like that. But also like even down to helping the cleaning staff to keep track of which room they have cleaned, which room they should clean next, and things like that. So kind of refer to it as the operating system for a hotel. So that's what Mews is doing.
And does Mews mainly work with sort of the larger chains, or is it working with more independent hotels, or does it work across the suite?
Our typical customer is an independent hotel, but we are making big steps forward in the chains. So we have a few chains right now with several hundreds of hotels in each chain. So globally today, we have onboarded about 6,000 hotels. And we are, as I said, making big progress into the enterprise segment, which will mean even larger chains. There are some chains out there with several thousands of hotels under a single brand. So that's interesting for sure.
A whole new concept of scale at that level, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
And talking about scale, I mean, I think Mews hit unicorn status earlier this year, wasn't it?
Yeah, just recently we did a follow-up round to investment round. So and officially kind of gained that unicorn status. I mean, to me, that's not maybe a big thing, but maybe that's easy to say when I've done it a couple of times before. And I
think it's 3 times now, isn't it? 3 times you've been in the growth seat for a while. The companies have gone through that unicorn milestone.
Probably. And even if I think back at the .com era, I probably did it once more, but temporary, right? Because it was just before the crash. So you got to be a unicorn and then suddenly you were not. And that's something I learned, like also at Klarna. I was both employed when we, I think, increased our valuation about 5 or 8 times and then cut it 10 times. So, those are rough time. And it was actually the same story at Connector. At the peak, I think the stock price was 130 kronas per share. And then that went down to 30. And that not
genuine roller coaster right then.
Yeah. Not even mentioning my experience before in the true .com crash. That was also the same. Like you take this humongous jumps in valuation, and then sooner or later you take a big hit as well, and then you have to recover from that. So I tend to not pay too much attention on the actual valuation, because usually that doesn't mean anything unless you're a public company. So it is what it is. But for sure, to me, the exciting thing is the dynamic environment, the high growth, like what's happening. That's not really driven by the valuation, but that's driven by the business and the people around the business.
Absolutely. Now, your title at Mews is Director of Engineering, isn't it? And I think that was also the same when you were working at Klarna as well. Now, since most of the audiences are CTOs or, at that strategic level, just tell us a little bit about the difference between the role expectations between the Director of Engineering and the CTO, do you think?
Yeah, there are a few differences. I was the CTO at Connector for a few years. And then as I joined Klarna, which was obviously a much bigger company, I actually kind of took on the title of Director of Engineering. And it was a bit of a deliberate. I wanted to try to work for a much larger company that had several benefits of doing that. Like the problems are bigger, usually at bigger companies. That comes with a deal. And in some ways, it kind of have the same requirements. Being a CTO at a smaller company or a director of engineering at a larger company, there are definitely similarities about that, because like the way I operate, I always ensure that the domain I'm leading as a director of engineering, I have a clear ownership of that. And as such, I can define the strategy and work with my teams and with the culture, the local culture even, in that domain that kind of diverges a little bit from the rest of the company. Not too much, but you have your own local flavor to it. So there are definitely similarities, but again, there are clear differences as well. As a CTO, it kind of stops at you, right? You are defining the engineering culture and the engineering strategy. Nobody above you really knows much about engineering usually, because you're reporting up to the CEO. So that's different. And when you are a director of engineering, you have that kind of usually foundation or help. That's also true for VPs of engineering, which is kind of a similar role. It depends on how you structure your organization. So you have someone above you that can help and coach you in your field. And that to me, invaluable, especially since I'm later in my career. I find myself even more open to feedback and picking up new things. So therefore, I really appreciate it.
So the value of that coaching is a strong draw to be at that level in the organization rather than sitting in the top deck.
Exactly. And I find myself now at Mews, I have a CTO who's really young. He's like 26 years old or something like that. So obviously I've been in the business for far longer, and so are the other VPs and most of the directors as well. And that creates a really interesting dynamic in my mind, something I really appreciate. And I can feel I can thrive in that setting.
Excellent. Yeah, and learning all the ways around is always going to be a great thing.
Yeah, for sure.
Talking about learning, let's hear about some of the things that you've learned that are, the key elements of scaling in these organizations. Because I think one of the things, because you did a talk recently, which I attended, which was really great, and you were talking about some of the differences in scaling approach between those companies. So what is it about scaling that you've ended up discovering is actually distinct between the different companies that you scaled?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. So obviously scaling with remote teams, that's probably the most different. So at Collector and before Collector, I was, as most of us were doing your regular at office work. And when you scale, you mostly looked at the developers or engineers you could hire in your city, or maybe if you have a couple of cities or a couple of hubs, you kind of look at those cities and you hire locally there, people that you expect to be in the office. Now, as I joined Klarna, exactly when I joined Klarna, the lockdowns happened so this was 2020. And that, like learning how to do that in a completely remote setting, that took me maybe a year before I was comfortable with how to think about scaling when you can do it remotely or for remote teams.
Only a year. That's great.
Yeah, well, I'm still learning, of course. But like after a year, I felt like, oh, something actually kind of clicked in me, and I was able to use it and really like, oh, this is a new field. I'm starting to be good at this, and I can know how to use it. And obviously, I'm still learning every day. So like, it's not like you're never done, and things are changing too much anyway. So, which is the fun part. But yeah, remote is probably the one thing. And then, I mean, scaling companies that are under regulatory burden is also different because before I was in the IT industry, and going way back, the .com era, nobody cared about anything, right? It was just
Wild West.
But scaling in regulatory companies is interesting, an interesting challenge. And I mean, you can say that you have to have a deep understanding of the regulations, and it's not about bending the rules. You can't do that really, but you can think of new ways on how to apply the rules to your business. So I think this is specifically when it comes to financial regulations, those are the same. Like even a small local bank in Sweden or the Nordics are under the same EU regulations as any of the global giants. It's just that you are a bit free in how you apply those rules and regulations. So that was important to me, like really understand how can I use this to my benefit? How can I not bend it, but, think of the regulations in different ways.
Yeah, awesome. I remember when I was scaling at Palantir, where we were scaling the European operation there. So, and what I discovered at that time was that we were sort of scaling in a different location. So it wasn't really remote, but it was, scaling a new office remote from everywhere else to a sort of an East Coast office and a West Coast office there at the time. And it was almost like we were trying to do it remotely, but way before remote became big and popular thing. And we were also in a I guess you would call it semi-regulated, but it was actually because we were working in the cleared space where people have government clearances to work on things. And there were some unique challenges that we faced there and some real bottlenecks in the process. So have you come across some of those real challenging bottlenecks where you sort of end up with a proper head scratch? How are you going to get yourself over that?
Yeah, several times actually. And like it's only like what I learned is that you have to be really on top of the regulations, but not only the regulations, like reading the regulations, that doesn't usually help you that much. You have to understand them, and how do you do that? Yeah, well, you have to work together with your compliance people and your like actually it's a fun story, but my brother was the chief risk officer, or I brought him in as the chief risk officer to Collector Bank. So And that helped because then I had a deep personal relationship with him, and we can kind of, talk about this in a different way and think about it in a different way. And I was probably the most progressive leader at the bank at the time. And just by his role, he was the most non-progressive leader because it was all about managing the risk. But we were able to meet in the middle, I think, and get something out of that. So however you do it, it might be hard to recruit your sibling to, but like you have to establish those deep relationship of trust with your counterpart, be that your compliance officers or your risk officers or whatever area you're in, and understand that. And it comes to the same if we talk about people management, like the HR rules or how you are able to acquire people, how you're able to fire people, how you're able to treat people once they are employees. Those laws and regulations are also a bit hard to understand, especially if you do that in
multiple jurisdictions
or 50 different countries. So establish those relationships and really work with your partners in those specific areas and make sure you have a deep understanding and deep respect for each other's specialization. And then you can kind of see what you can do too.
That's a good takeaway, actually, to really build up those partnerships across the different areas of the business, especially the ones where there is a constraint or bottleneck to overcome. I really like that. Good stuff. Let's dig into the remote thing. You were mentioning about that before, about the transition to learning how to hire remotely. So in your experience, what are sort of the biggest advantages of building a remote first team compared to building a co-located team?
So I think the biggest single advantage is actually the proposition, what you're offering to your existing or future employees. I mean, to me personally, and to many other people I've seen, working from home is pretty much the only way to get your work-life balance in order. Like and it has disadvantages too, for sure, but those things are, to me, easier to address. And, very concretely for me personally, I traded half an hour of stress on the train and changing between buses and, getting too hot or too cold or too wet or whatever. I've changed that for a daily walk with a dog in the forest every morning. So, I mean, those kind of changes, I think there's no price for that. Like I can't even imagine going back. And I think this is true. Everybody will have their own story, right? So this is true for every single employee, but in a different way. So this might be your digital nomad that wants to try to work from a different country every month or whatever. Like there are things that you can do. We have supported numbers of employees that want to relocate, that want to go from Prague to Amsterdam or from Croatia to Spain or whatever. And we've supported those employees to do that because it's worth so much and they become so much happier. And a happy employee is like, there's no other thing you can do. If you can make your employees 10% happier, there's nothing else you can do to increase your productivity. So what's your take then on some of these big changes with people, announcing return to office policies? I mean, we've seen one recently from Amazon, which was rather scathed across LinkedIn and other news sources, when that was announced. What's your view on that? I'm actually a bit surprised that they are going through with it, and I'm eager to see what the effect will be. Short term, I'm happy because that will mean I'm extending my pool of candidates, right? It's amazing. I tell you, there are going to be a lot of people quitting, I think, as a result, or there will be some exception management going on at Amazon where they kind of, oh, well, it wasn't for everybody. This team can continue remote and whatever, but I don't know why they're doing it. And I'm surprised, and I'm eager to see the results of this because I think it can turn into a slow disaster. Like nobody will leave over day. Of course not. But, you take your time, you realize, oh, this is not worth it anymore. And you're probably happy to maybe go down in salary or general compensation that you can only get by working for those big giants, but you start valuing your personal life and your work-life balance more.
Yeah, because I think it is going to have an immediate impact. I think there are definitely some people who had set up their life based on having a remote possible employment, had moved to a different city, moved to a different location, which is not near one of the Amazon offices, for example. And now, as far as you're concerned, they become targets for recruitment.
Exactly. And I think I saw, I can't remember if it's HP or Dell doing the same now and just right after Amazon. So let's see what happens. Yeah.
So talking of mistakes then, I mean, what, in terms of mistakes that you've made or had happen while you've been building remote teams, what are the ones that sort of stick out in your mind?
So one thing that's maybe not specifically remote teams because this was before, but At Collector at the time, I realized afterwards that I didn't spend enough time building up our talent acquisition team. So we just kind of expected our people team to handle it without really being clear with the requirements and being clear that, hey, we're gonna significantly scale when it comes to our engineering team in the coming 3 years. So you better staff up. We never said that. So as a result, I think we spent like our TA, our top of the funnel, was not efficient enough. So this was completely, I learned this as I joined Klarna, which obviously during my time at Klarna, I think we grew the company by 3,000 employees or something ridiculous like that. Yeah. So then you had this kind of well-staffed and well-oiled talent acquisition team. And it's the same at Mews. I mean, we are much smaller, obviously. We are 1,000 employees now. But I can see that we are making the proper investments into TA. So that was one of the first mistakes. When scaling rapidly, you have to have a super wide pipeline that's continuously full of candidates. Some of them will be good, some of them will not. And that's kind of the point. You never know until you kind of put them in front of your team.
But if you don't have them coming into the top of the funnel, you can't test them, you can't grade them, you can't figure out which ones are the amazing guys.
Yeah. So that's one mistake I personally made. And then I've seen other mistakes or, people trying to, when it comes to remote, I mean, just make sure that people have a decent home office. Make sure they have the option to work from a co-working space if they prefer that. Like working from your home is not necessarily for everybody. And I have, like, especially if you're younger, maybe you're completely alone in some sad apartment where you don't want to be. So make sure you have access to a co-working space in that case. That can do wonders. So working remotely is not working from home for everybody.
That's a really good point, actually, isn't it? And so what do you do at Mews? Do you make available certain sort of co-located working spaces, or do you give people a budget to choose where they go and work in a co-working space themselves, or how does that work?
Yeah, we have this kind of service that collects kind of probably the 15 biggest co-working spaces in Europe. And like if you live in a city where none of those are available, you can just expense it. So like there's a budget, but we also provide you with a kind of discounted service where from a single company. But of course, if that doesn't fulfill your needs, you will have to have something else. And
yeah,
you just
and then for those people who do choose to work at home, do you do something separate for them?
Oh yeah, I mean, and this is nothing unique. I think like there's a budget for buying some screen and keyboard and mouse, like and make sure to also encourage your employees to how's your share? Like is it okay? Or how's your internet connection? Things like that. And I mean, sometimes there's even not a need for a specific budget. We have a budget, but you can also just talk about it. Like, hey, even if you're paying for it yourself, maybe it's worth it having a proper share. Or if you can have a budget for it, that's even better, of course.
Yeah, brilliant. So I think that's one of those key things, isn't it? Is watching for what mistakes you've made in the past, watching for what people have made,
yeah,
and then figuring out how to tackle it generally.
Yeah, for sure.
And then one of those other things is that people often talk about when the differences between remote teams and other teams, but in general, it's just a challenge when scaling fast, is how do you keep the people together? How do you keep the culture as a unified single thing rather than it being this diluted or fragmented thing when you're sort of pouring lots of new people in to organization who all bring their outside culture and previous experiences with them. So how have you tackled, sort of continuity of the culture within the scaling environment?
Yeah. And that's obviously, as you said, the problem, both like no matter if you're doing remote or not, but I think there are some additional nuances if you're doing it remotely that adds to it. But let's start talking about it more in general, like how can you do that? And I think something I started saying in the very top of our conversation was talking about having leaders owning their domain. So if you're a large company, I would heavily encourage to break that domain into more manageable pieces and then give full ownership and of course accountability coming with that ownership to leaders that you really trust. So whatever you call this is of course different. At Klarna, we call it domains. At Mews, we call it tribes. At Collector, I think we just call it departments or whatever. But it doesn't really matter. The point is that you can have leaders that are allowed to do their thing inside that. And this kind of domains, maybe they should be somewhere between 20 and 100 people. They're getting bigger than that. You're probably better off splitting it into multiple domains. And this allows you to have kind of a local flavor to the culture and make it more kind of manageable for everybody as you grow to kind of.
So you actually encourage that diversity of culture and sort of mini cultures within the tribes then?
Yeah, I think you have to. Of course, this have to kind of lay on the foundation of a strong company culture that goes across everything, that you're like, this is what we expect from everyone being at Mews or at Klarna or whatever. And those should be super strong, and you should, hire for them and incorporate them in your interview processes and things like that. But when it comes down to it, like you also have to have this local flavor where you can kind of, this is how we are bringing this value, company value into life in our domain. If it's the same as other domains, that's fine, but it allow for that to have a local flavor as well. I think that's important.
Cool. So it's more variations on the same taste rather than something that's unique and different then.
Yeah. I would never encourage completely unique values. That doesn't make sense at all. But have your own local variation or take on that, and make sure to talk about that and talk about it in the localized context, because your people will get the exposure from the company values. Anyway, that will be on the big all-hand conferences or all-hand meetings, that will be the company values, and you will kind of get sick and tired of that maybe. So I think kind of the localized, and this also works down even to individual teams, right? You have a strong engineering manager or team lead that kind of takes both the company values, the kind of domain values, and then incorporate the team values on top of that, adding to it, but making sure you encourage this kind of local culture in Thrive.
But then I guess that's one of the key lessons then, is if you're preparing to scale, one of the most important things first is to establish the baseline culture that you can then have variations and flavors on top of that. So is that a stage that you've been involved with, or have you ever had to in an organization kind of go back and go, okay, let's just pin the culture into a certain place and make sure we establish that before we begin to scale?
Yeah. I've been part of the conversation. Obviously, there's always a culture from if you're not starting the company as a founder yourself, you are kind of inheriting something. But then undoubtedly you will also, as part of the executive team or some management team, you will also work on how do we bring this forward, because it has to live, it has to change constantly all the time. There's different ways of doing it. I wouldn't say I have a strong playbook for that. I just think you have to adopt and listen in and make sure it's bottom up as much as possible. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. And I've been through this exercises where you have hundreds of deep interviews from consultants coming in trying to establish the new values. And usually it fails, but usually it also kind of brings something out. And you have to hang on to that and distill it down to what is actually our value. And make sure, I think it's interesting also to see companies like Google and Facebook or Meta, we have seen them in the public also rethinking their values,
evolving them over time.
Yeah, evolving them, exactly, and that has to happen everywhere. It's not only the mega companies. You have to do it in your regular companies as well.
Yeah, because if it doesn't evolve, if it isn't a living thing, then it's not anymore the culture. The culture risks drifting away from what you have written on the wall, which is a criticism we see in a lot of more established and older organizations, isn't it? There's some things written on the wall, and then it's what actually happens.
Yeah, you have to be able to change that, and then as you change it, you have to also dare to keep it for a while. It takes time before it sticks and before it kind of is accepted. So you have to keep at it in the beginning, but then you have to, almost as soon as it starts working, you almost have to start thinking, okay, now it's time to start thinking about how to evolve it or change it again.
Yeah.
So that's a constant battle.
Constant thing. Cool. And so before you were talking about the sort of the different ways of dividing up the teams into different sort of areas. And I think one of the criticisms that we get is that, aren't you going to end up with silos within your organization? Are you going to end up with these, sort of uncommunicating, separated, distinct pieces of fiefdom that people control as a sort of a local leader that doesn't really interact with people?
Definitely. And I think that's great. And let me maybe elaborate on that, because yes, And there's a cost of this. There's a cost of less efficient communication, there's an efficiency cost of having silos that work on their own. But especially if you're growing quickly, and this only applies to that. Like if you're having a status quo organization or an organization that's actually shrinking, it's all about efficiency, right? And that's when you need to break the silos. You want to look at, hey, can we take this thing we're doing and make it even more efficient? But if you're scaling, and usually that also means you're on some kind of innovation pathway, like you want to achieve something bigger, you're growing because you have a great ambitions and great vision. I think the cost you're paying in less efficiency by having local domain leaders or whatever you call them that have freedom, that's so worth it, because you can never kind of have scale as things are changing so quickly. Like if you want to achieve efficiency, the first thing you have to achieve is stability. And that's just not possible if you're scaling quickly. Like it will.
That's kind of the opposite of what you're trying to achieve, isn't it? Really?
Exactly. So if you are decided to scale and you need that, and that's very, very expensive. Let's be honest about that. Like it's super expensive to scale. But if you have decided to do that, you have to execute, and you have to allow for strong, accountable leaders coming in that you fully trust, that are able to drive an area forward, and they want to minimize dependencies as much as possible. And that creates the silos. And in this case, I think the silos are a good thing.
Okay, so the cutting of the dependencies and the minimizing you're not trying to minimize cost. It's going to be expensive. So it really is about creating stability within a small area as you scale it, so that you can scale it fast. Now, you mentioned there that the cost is very high, but I've got a feeling that you're not just talking about the salaries that you're paying out. I've got a feeling you're talking about a bunch of other different things. So could you just sort of clarify what you mean about how expensive it is to scale?
Yeah, so we've all heard about the law of diminishing returns, right? And that's definitely true when it comes to hiring your 10th or your 100th or your 1,000th engineer, right? So if you're growing a team from 3 people to 6 people, no one is expecting double output, because you realize that, this is going to create communication overhead and management overhead and things like that. And that's fine. But you can still kind of expect maybe I can achieve a 50% increase of output. But then if you scale that 6-person team to 12, like then it's probably not even a 50% increase of output. It's probably closer to 30. And if you scale it from 12 to 25 or to 50 or to 100, that kind of goes down very, very quickly. So as soon as you have reached kind of 50 people in your engineering team, how much additional value do you get from your 51st engineer? Like it's almost nothing. So that's what I mean with the cost of scaling. But like even if the incremental value of your latest engineer is very, very low, I haven't cracked any other code of growing your overall output. Like, of course, we should also look at how can we be more efficient. But then again, efficiency usually comes when you have a super stable environment and you can create super strong processes. And if you're growing quickly, you don't have that. So efficiency during hypergrowth or quick scaling, usually not possible. So
going into hypergrowth, that's one of those key things to accept then, that you're basically kissing goodbye to efficiency here, because scaling is overridingly more important than the efficiency.
And that means that your incremental value for each added engineer is even lower. So that's the true expense of growing, that you still pay something the same salary as you do, but you can only get 10% or even 1% of the output as you could in the beginning of your scaling journey.
But there just is no other way of getting an output of that size without scaling the number of people.
No, I don't know. Like maybe the other way would be, let's have an engineering organization of 5,000 people and have it be stable for 5 years, and then start making efficiency gains. And it's like, we are not like that's not what you're doing, right?
You've got to get there in the first place somehow.
Exactly. You have to get there. So I think that's the true cost of scaling. And further on to that, so this is going to be a long answer to your question, but I think it's appropriate. So the incremental improvement that I'm now arguing is diminishing for each added engineer that is when that engineer is productive in the first place. So before that, you have to onboard them, right? You have to hire them, of course, which is a
time-consuming action in its own right.
Yeah, but you actually have to get them there. And during that time, that engineer is probably having a negative impact on your overall output, right? For the first 6 months or whatever it is in your environment.
Until they get to the point of parity, basically, and they're giving back more than they're taking out to the organization to support them.
Exactly. And that might, there's a lot of talk, how long time to the first PR? And we can make it in 2 days or whatever. And we can do that as well at Mews, and I've been doing it at other companies as well, but that's not true value, right? That's artificial value to me. It is usually taking several months before you reach that kind of net zero state. And then is the kind of question, how much further can you drive the productivity with the increased overhead and complexity? And
bearing in mind that as that person then becomes productive, they're also beginning to help others who are going through the onboarding process then. So there's a drain on their time straight away.
Exactly. And that's a great point. I think I mentioned it in my talk the other week, that use your new employees that are 6 months in, use them for onboarding. Those are your best onboarding buddies for your new hires, because they know exactly what the new person needs to learn. Where was the information lacking? Where were the guides not complete enough? What were the tricks I needed to get the local build running for this and that project or whatever? So make sure to, the employees that you don't have full trust in them yet because they haven't had the chance to show them. Those are usually the ones you want to have carrying the heaviest load when it comes to onboarding new people. And that can be scary as a manager or as a leader.
Yeah. It does have sort of a great variability that comes with it. I mean, one of the things I remember from scaling quickly at Palantir is we made everybody who came on board own the onboarding materials. So they were kind of, everybody who was onboarding anew with people who were updating and creating, in some cases, that documentation to make that a more efficient process, by which very process makes it a lot more varied and variable in terms of the outcome, because it's people who you're least certain of who are creating, the onboarding process for the next people joining.
Yeah, exactly. And as a manager or leader higher up in that organization, you just have to, oh my God, what's happening? But I think that's fine. And I mean, you will also make mishires if you're growing quickly. And it's so important to manage this, because if you can't trust the new employees with this kind of responsibility to bring on the next wave, they are not going to be helpful to you to grow the organization. And growing the organization is probably your number one priority, right? It's hurts a lot. Yeah, as a leader, and almost for a lot of the employees as well. It is your number. You have to accept that it will take a lot of effort from the teams and from the existing employees to help grow, but you do it for the future, right? It's not to increase your productivity in the next month or the next 3 months, but it is to increase the productivity or output, I should say, in the next year. So yeah, I think
so. That by the time you get to that 5-year milestone, you can then start working on some efficiency.
Exactly. Yeah,
good stuff. Well, you mentioned earlier on about structure as well. I'd love to just dig a bit further into that, because you came out with one of the greatest neologisms that I've seen in the last 5 years, Yawnoc, which when you explain it is super obvious, but I'd love you to talk it through us because I think it's brilliant.
Yeah. So Yawnoc is just a fun thing it's Conway in reverse. And Conway's law, I think a lot of people have heard about. It's about the fact that if any system architecture is reflected in the organization you have. So that means that if you have two teams sitting on different stories in the building, you can expect to find a decently kind of defined interface between those. That might be an API. And that's so fun to see. When you have the teams sitting really close together, you have this kind of, there's no real blockers or we don't care about dependencies. But as soon as you have a team in a different building or a different floor in the same building, or I guess in a different city, you expect to have that reflected in the system architecture. And
generally, Conway's law says that any software platform will reflect the communication structure of an organization that built it, doesn't it?
Exactly. That's exactly what it says. And
so talk us through reverse Conway's law and how you use that as part of the scaling process.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of Yawnoc, being the reverse Conway's maneuver is how you are deliberately creating an organization first and splitting the domain by splitting the teams or the domains, so that you expect the architecture of the system to follow that over time. So this will take time. It's not a quick fix, obviously not. But by doing this, you deliberately also change the architecture of the system that you're building. And this is like the fun I made by the reverse Conway maneuver is very well known, and I've used it a lot of times. But I realized that Yawnoc, which is Conway backwards, is a great name for it. Use the Yawnoc strategy to improve your architecture, and that might be splitting a team that before, like, they were sitting very close together. And when I say sit together, you also have to imagine that this applies to remote setting as well. Like, it's not about
it's how closely people collaborate rather than physically where they're located.
Exactly. So they sit together, and then you need to break that monolith or make sure that you introduce some asynchronous processing between two components. And the best way to do that is probably just to split the teams into two teams and fill them with new employees, and then you have successfully executed a Yawnoc.
And this is amazing because I think, it's one of those things where you're the director of engineering, but your main thing is trying to figure out how to use people. But ultimately, you're actually affecting the physical architecture of the platform by changing the people structures that as you grow it and building those silos, those groups quite deliberately in such a way that you effectively architect the software from about 3 stages of remoteness.
Yeah, for sure. And that's totally what's happening. You just have to remember that it takes time. So changing the system architecture in this way, it takes probably a couple of years before you can really see it, at least if you have a reasonable complex system that's also being used. Like, that's kind of but that's usually the way it is, at least where I've been working. You don't build something in isolation. Like, you have something, the plane is flying, you have to rebuild it in mid-flight, as everybody talking about. So you won't see the results immediately. But the thing is, any other way I have tried to achieve the same thing, like dictating the use of a certain API structure or dictating the use of some kind of message bus or whatever it might be, which is a more direct way of achieving the same thing, that also takes a long time as well. Like, because you don't have the time to focus on this, you have to build features in the meantime. And by using Yawnoc, you achieve the same thing.
But you don't have to know the intricate technical details of what it is. You leave the teams to figure out that bit. You just set up the structure so that they have to use some sort of communication bus.
Exactly. And I don't really care if it's an Azure service bus or a Kafka. That doesn't matter usually. Sometimes there's a strong company convergence around a certain platform. Okay, let's use that. Then you get it for free, the choice. But otherwise, in many cases, the team can just choose for themselves, and it turns out pretty fine.
I mean, in the end, it's software. Anything's possible, right? So
exactly. And if you have separated the domain in such a way, and you did it on Azure Service Bus, and you later figure out that, we need to centralize on Kafka, that's usually pretty simple. It's not that big of a difference, because the big thing you did was untangling all the business logic and all the dependencies, and then the actual technology that you used to shuffle those messages back and forth, it's probably doesn't matter that much.
Fairly trivial at that point. So all of this kind of indicates that you need an amazing level of prescience to be able to look forward quite a long way before you even start to scale. So can we sort of boil down your approach to scaling into a playbook of a few key pieces? I was going to say steps, but I think it's a few key pieces, isn't it?
Yeah, I think we can try at least. So yeah, for me, the first step would be to plan this out from an organizational point of view. So that means establish your silos or your domains, whatever you call them. Don't be too afraid of them being too strong. Think about how to split it. Think about how much power can you delegate. The more, the better. If you're talking about scaling, you will not have the time to have all that power yourself anyway. It's getting impossible at that point. So I think that's great. And figure out your Conway or Yawnoc strategies for bringing the architecture to where you need it to be. And then the second step to me would be to start defining how you're going to hire. As I talked before, ensure you have a proper talent acquisition team if you don't already. If you have one, Like, go talk to them and see how will you handle bringing in 10 times more candidates at the top of the pipeline? Like, how does that work? Make sure you talk to them also about KPIs. Which KPIs are you using? And
so really set the expectations and make it clear what you expect the outcomes to be as well.
Yes. And also have a healthy dynamic conversation, because when I say KPIs, TA teams usually care about metrics that are proxy metrics, which they think are the ones that helps the business. So that might be time to hire or lead time to hire, or a number of hires where we hit the target date.
So the things that kind of indicate speed of spinning the wheels.
Exactly. But as a leader of that organization, like, I don't care if I'm 1 month late hiring someone, if it has a slightly higher likelihood of being the right person, because the expense of mishiring is so high. So I want to always kind of...
And that's not a cost that the TA team bear, that's a cost that you bear.
Exactly. And I will bear it for months, or in some cases years, before I realized that, there were actually a better candidate that I could have hired at just a month of additional time. So ensure to talk about that with your TA team. Like, how do we manage this, and how do we ensure that we're kind of going in the right direction together, hand in hand?
And what about the actual sort of interview processes itself and the conversations you have with those candidates to shuffle them through the pipeline?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of different solutions. To be honest, I'm not sure I have a golden path. Like, experiment a lot. Try it. Like at Klarna, we had one thing where we had a very strict that every single employee did a general cognitivity test or assessment at the start of the funnel.
So the independent third-party test of some sort.
Yeah, exactly. And it was the same test even if you were like in data science or engineering, or even...
So completely normalized then.
Yeah. Like an IQ test. That was one way of doing it. There are fair criticism of that model, but like it worked for Klarna. It was fine. I've been, going back and forth on take-home assignment versus live coding and stuff like that. I just encourage everybody to try and experiment with different things. What we are trying now is, instead of a take-home assignment where the candidate is submitting a PR, we give them a PR, which we know have flaws. And we kind of set it up so that, like, here's a PR written by an intern or junior developer. Can you please coach them and tell them where they did wrong, help them? We kind of like that model, but again, you can cheat with that as well. I mean, you can use ChatGPT.
You can game anything that gets published and known about after a while, right?
Exactly. And then, so that would argue for live coding, but live coding is probably, you might end up over-indexing on a certain personality type that's not necessarily the personality type you need in your teams, because you will have someone who's maybe a bit more extrovert, a bit more comfortable in bullshitting or things like that. Whereas maybe what you really need is more of an introverted type, which is purely analytical, and those might fail the live coding test. So, I mean, there are hundreds of strategies here. I would just encourage testing and trying out and experimenting.
And I guess some of those are going to fit better with culture and values that you want to have, and some not so much. So experiment on which ones actually fit well there.
Exactly. And as long as you have a proper hiring team and a proper TA team, you will also have the capacity to do some experiments and try different things. So I think that's the most important lesson.
Good one. Cool. So that was step 2. So we've done planning, getting organizations straight. We've got building, which is putting together your sort of recruiting funnel and your talent acquisition process along with the actual interview process. What comes next?
Yeah. So that will be getting these people up to speed, enabling or getting them to actually work. And we already talked about onboarding. Make sure you allocate proper time and budget for that. Do not overpromise your stakeholders. Like, that's because when you do financial planning or budgeting or whatever you call it, like, but then we bring in this team in April. Yeah, well, we will not bring in 6 new people in April. We will have to hire them staggered. So first of all, we will have 1 in February, 2 in March, 3 in April, something like that. So they will come in, sliding in, and then none of them will be properly productive for the first few months. So you really end up with your productive team maybe in August. So it's like the rest is cost of hiring and cost of onboarding. And you need to be very clear with that with your stakeholders, because otherwise you're going to set up yourself for failure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of those things. The mythical man month is a very real thing in this situation. Adding a bunch more engineers is not going to accelerate anything. In fact, it actually generally slows things down.
Exactly. And make sure that
so under promise and over deliver then.
Yeah. And make sure to take those hidden costs into consideration of lesser productivity in the beginning.
Yeah, you can hide them with 1 or 2 employees, but you can't hide it at scale.
No, exactly. And then the last step in this kind of four-step model would be just how do I win, right? How do I really bring this? And that's going to be all about people and culture management, which we talked about. And I've talked about some solutions to that, but like really focus on your people, take care of them, invest in them. Because again, the expense for churning people is really, like if you consider the cost of hiring, including onboarding and including TA and including all the interviews you have to do, it's going to be really expensive to have people leaving your business unless you want them to. So that's costly. So make sure you invest in the people you have. Make sure they are learning. Like you can never forget about investing in proper. How do you do that? If you send them to conferences or if you allow for crazy Fridays or whatever you do.
I've never met an engineer that didn't want to learn.
No, exactly. And if you do, maybe they are not the right for you, because if you have engineers that are not learning, if not every day, so at least every week, they are not going to be fit for your future organization because it will look so different than it did just 6 months ago. So you have to have that kind of people that are ready to adopt their skills and their mindset.
It's often one of the selection criteria in the first place for joining a growing company, is that people join a growing organization to learn with it and therefore sort of rise themselves up with the floating tide of the growth of the organization.
Absolutely. That's one of the things we definitely focus on. What's your approach to learning? And if you have an engineer that can't answer that or that's confused by that question, that's telling you something like, oh, you haven't thought about this a lot, right? Are you really sure you are suitable for working here? Because you will need to learn and you need to be deliberate in how do I learn in an efficient way? And like, it's okay to try out new things, but you also have to be very aware. How do I work? Do I prefer watching YouTube or reading a textbook or going to a conference? And why is that? And how do I work when I absorb information? So that's going to be really important. So make sure you really invest into that. And then culture, which we already talked about. That's going to be everything. And we talked about a couple of ways on how to achieve that. My take is local leadership is going to be everything. Make sure that you have those engineering managers or VPs or directors of engineering that you have full trust in, that you really trust in driving their own local variance of the culture.
And so those must be some of the hardest hires to get right then, because you need to delegate an awful lot of trust to them very quickly early on in that growth phase. Do you have any sort of differences or particular tips around hiring your future leaders and your future managers as opposed to hiring individual contributors?
No, I can't think of anything like very concrete. This is very much, you go by your gut feeling. You're wrong a lot of the times, but the times you're right is usually more, and that ends up multiplying. So, and of course, like it's easy to say that, well, if you have someone, make sure they are involved in the future decision, and they should be, but you should always also talk about, like, we're not looking for a copy of this other person, because we're looking to add to the culture. It's not about fitting into the culture. It's about adding to the culture. How can we bring people in that will bring us forward? And that's uncomfortable in the beginning, especially if you have someone that's kind of overconfident, but might like have that they haven't really worked with themselves. They haven't really reflected what's my value, what am I bringing to the table. So be sure to talk about that with your team. And I think that's going to help you find the right future.
Yeah, and I think those kinds of hires are most uncomfortable, the earliest ones that you make, because they make such a biggest sort of difference in the immediate culture as they come on board. And you often need some of them early on to handle that scaling process, don't you?
Absolutely. And also don't be afraid to not promote your oldest engineering manager in the team, or the oldest, I don't mean that, but with
long-standing.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes they are just fine. And even staying as an individual contributor, as a principal engineer or something like that, let them stay there because that's where they are comfortable. And at Mews, we have several instances of senior engineers and senior ICs being promoted to engineering managers, finding out that this doesn't work at all. And they go back to being like a senior IC instead. I think that can be
and being a very successful senior IC at that.
Yeah, exactly. And they know a lot more about themselves at this point, right? So don't take for granted that your most experienced engineering manager is going to be your next director of engineering. It's a completely different job title, and maybe this manager should just stay manager, become more senior, become better, but expand their influence in other ways.
I think that's a great tip. I think that's one of the things our profession has got better at, is recognizing that there is a leadership and a management track, and it is different from being an individual, whether that's an architect, a senior engineer, the staff consultant, whatever it might be, that they are distinct career tracks. I think we've got better as an industry at sort of recognizing that.
For sure. And I just want to mention one more thing. If there's one thing that I like to measure more centralized, it is the improvements. So, and this is, of course, like the one measurement to rule them all. Like, show me as a team or as a department or domain how you are improving every day or every week or every month. Any other metrics kind of becomes slightly obsolete when you think about it that way. Like, you measure what you need to measure to improve. I don't really care about that, but show me that you're improving. And that might be 1 month that you reduce the backlog of customer defects or whatever, or your cycle time went down, or whatever you want to look at from the DORA metrics or anything like that. Usually, if you can show me that you have a systematic approach to improvement, that's going to be enough. So that's my one metric. And then, of course, over time, you're going to experiment with different metrics, and that's going to be fine. But focus on the improvement one. I think that's
amazing. So it's quite an abstract idea of winning, but at the same time, it's flexible enough to incorporate all the different kinds of teams and different kinds of individuals you're going to have in your organization.
Exactly.
Cool. So let's summarize it quickly then. So we've got the idea of planning, setting up, building. So that's actually doing the recruitment, pulling people into the organization, getting them on board. We've got enabling. So things like, setting up your culture, setting up your domains, and the actual onboarding process itself. And then we've got winning. So measuring, building the culture, the improvements, which you spoke about. Is that a sequential approach?
Yeah, that would be great if it was, right? But like, no, the fact is, if you are actually growing quickly, and by that, like let's take 50% per year or something like that. That I would say you qualify for some kind of hypergrowth or whatever. Then you're absolutely going to have to execute in all those 4 areas at the same time, all the time. So, and that makes your life very interesting, sometimes stressful, but I think that's also part of the game, as long as you have the ability to go for that walk in the forest or whatever you do to re-energize you. You have to accept that no plan will survive the reality, right? So you have to work on all of this at different timescales, also at different horizons, right? You want to figure out, how do I bring in 10 people next month? And also, how do I bring in 100 people in 2 years? Like, and you have to think about those two things at the same time, which are completely different questions, right? One is where you have to focus on what do I do tomorrow? And one is, how do I make sure that the people I hire 6 months from now are ready to help me onboard the next people that I want to hire? Things like that. So,
a real blend of the tactic and the strategic approach.
Yeah, exactly. And be ready to jump between the two, like multiple times every single day. I think that's going to be necessary.
Of course. Context switching does become one of those hallmarks of the senior leadership in engineering, doesn't it?
True. That is true.
Fantastic. So it's, we've gone through there quite a good set of things to do in terms of scaling an organizational fast. If you had to give one piece of advice to a CTO or a senior technology leader who is just beginning their journey into either scaling or in their career overall, what would that be? Sort of the magic ingredient from your perspective?
Oh, I have several, but I will pick a couple maybe. So break the rules, I think, like because the rules are usually built on how the company looked yesterday, and you're thinking about how will the company look tomorrow. So you have to break the rules by definition. I think that's really important. to me, and a really interesting advice when it comes to also working as a remote company, be personal, be human. I am much more comfortable sharing about my personal life since I started working from home. When I was at the office, I took on my suit or whatever. That was my uniform. I went to work and I left home behind. I think now working remotely, I compensate by sharing a lot more about my personal life, and people seem to enjoy that. Like, what a thought. We are human beings and we like kind of knowing things about each other. And I think that makes for a much more, and that's also invest in the people, but that usually comes with the same, like, share about yourself, make sure you invite others to share about them, and then care about your people. That's going to be what brings success in the end.
What a brilliant set of tips. Magnus, before we go on, how can people get in touch with you to basically ask you about scaling or to talk to you?
I mean, reach out on LinkedIn. To be honest, I'm not super quick at responding, but I will get there eventually. I mean, I think LinkedIn is really making a great, like, how can a social network be that is not Facebook or Instagram? So I think LinkedIn is a really powerful space. So reach out there, please, and I will get to you eventually.
Brilliant. Reach out on LinkedIn and we'll put the link into the show notes for you. Magnus, it's been fabulous to talk to you. Thank you very much for your time today. And for the listeners who are checking this out, you can obviously have a look at Magnus's credentials and background, see how he's managed to grow. We're not sure whether it's 3 or 4 unicorns, but definitely more than 2. And keep growing, keep having fun. Thanks very much, Magnus.
Thank you so much, Adam, for having me. I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for listening all the way through to the end. Just before you go, I'd like to ask you for one thing in return for putting together all these episodes of the CTO Playbook podcast for you. Please leave a review. Wherever you're listening, whether that is Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whichever platform you're on, leaving a quick review will help more CTOs find the podcast and enable me to create more great episodes. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of the CTO Playbook.